Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I am your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. The debate about Canada's lagging prosperity has never been more important and existential. Are we really poorer than Alabama? Here to discuss is Alicia Planincic. She is the Director of Policy and Economics at the Business Council of Alberta. Welcome back to Boom and Bust.
Thanks so much for having me.
I guess the first question is there's a lot of data points on this, and I know you've poured through this, Alicia. Canada's relative position, we've got GDP per capita, we've got the health development index, et cetera. So can you just walk us through the numbers and what they say about Canada's position?
Yeah, so this has been kind of a hot conversation topic for a while. We kind of joke that it's right up there with hockey in terms of our competitiveness with the US is how are we doing in terms of our economic performance? And of course, the conversation has been about Canada lagging the US. And I think the stat that really was very juicy and attention grabbing, frankly, was the one, and you've probably seen it, where all Canadian provinces are essentially poorer than the state of Alabama as measured by what we call per capita GDP or GDP adjusted for population. And so that was really where we became interested in this topic of, some of the criticism was, well, American style GDP, that doesn't really apply to us. So many of the things that make Canada great really aren't captured in GDP. So maybe this isn't something that we should worry about. And so that's where we stumbled upon this database from the OECD called the How's Life database. And so what it does is it looks at indicators, sort of a broad range of indicators. So that includes kind of your traditional economic indicators, jobs and income, but also quality of life measures like health and crime and safety, and even just community connection. So it gives us a much broader sense for, really how is life in Canada compared to the US.
And what do those indicators tell us?
Yeah, so there's some good news and there's some bad news. So the good news is we looked at about 40 indicators and we're able to make that fair comparison, Canada versus the US. And so the good news is that if you look, based on the latest data today, Canada does actually outperform the US on 28 of those indicators. So I think that gives some support to folks who say GDP per capita. It's not everything. There's more to the story in Canada. So that's good. And I will also say that we improved. We looked over the decade, and Canada improved on about as many indicators as the US. So also good news. The bad news, however, is especially when we look at those indicators that get at that economic health, so income and wealth and jobs. Yes, both countries improved, but the divergence between Canada and the US is so stark.
Right.
If you look at just kind of average income and average wealth over the decade, in the US, it grew at twice the rate that it did in Canada. And so that's where I think there is some truth to this per capita GDP story as being really real and meaningful to Canadians. If you were to ask the average Canadian, if your income grew at double the rate that it actually did over the last 10 years, would your life be better and more, in meaningful ways? I would say yes, absolutely. And so I think that's where there's really cause for concern based on our analysis.
Yeah, and really for most people, Alicia, it's going to be without all the mumbo jumbo. No offense to anybody, but it's really about after tax income, isn't it? And that's really how people really measure their wealth and success.
Exactly. It's the dollars that you actually have to spend on the things that you value. And so that was, one of the measures that was so starkly different in Canada versus the US, where, it's about 10% growth in Canada versus about 20% for the average Canadian. So just a huge difference. And especially when it comes to average wealth too, even more of a divergence between Canada and the US. And then I think the second kind of concerning trend that we noticed is even in those measures that I think Canadians take a lot of pride in and feel that we do better than the US, things like health and safety, there was some deterioration over the last 10 years. And so even though, some indicators certainly worse in the US than in Canada, that trajectory isn't very good and I think should be really taken seriously. When you see things like more Canadians don't feel comfortable or safe walking alone at night, or more Canadians report that their health is not good or that their mental health is not good. And one of the most concerning is just the small percentage of Canadians that said that they have a safety net, so or
Right.
a community support system, if they need help. So kind of those broader measures too,
Right.
it's not perfect. And I would argue that there's probably some connection with our poor
Sure.
economic health that's playing into some of those other measures.
Okay, we'll keep unpacking that, Alicia. We're just going to take a brief commercial break. We'll be right back with you. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. Our guest is Alicia Planincic. She is the Director of Policy and Economics at the Business Council of Alberta. Yeah, Alicia, we're getting into these more, talking about how Canadians feel about where they are situated in terms of wealth and safety. So your last point was that on some of these other measures, safety, health outcomes, these are starting to deteriorate. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's some deterioration there too. And I think, again, the point that I was making is I think those are probably not unrelated from our economic indicators. I mean, probably don't need to explain this, but when our incomes don't grow as much, those we see those other consequences on, crime and safety, poor health outcomes. All those things are just so directly tied to one another.
Exactly. What about the generational divide? I want to talk a little bit about that. How are younger Canadians faring versus, let's face it, wealthier, older Canadians?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's really a concern here is when we see this trend over time, we've, gotten so used to things just continue to improve, right? That is sort of just our expectation based on economic growth. And that's what we've seen generation to generation. And all of a sudden, we're seeing this very strange time where we see a long period where standards of living just simply haven't improved. And so you definitely notice it when you look at the incomes of younger people relative to older people. The wealth to housing affordability is playing a role where the opportunities and the opportunity for advancement and growth is just not as much for younger people as it was for older Canadians when they were sort of coming up in their jobs and careers.
Yeah, and there's obviously you're not in charge of these statistics, but from I think it's from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, they're saying that there's more businesses closing in Canada versus opening. And so this leads to the issue as, are people seeking, if you're a young person with talent and skills, are you seeking opportunities elsewhere other than Canada? Is that part of what's going on? Do you have any thoughts about this at
Yeah,
all?
I think it's a great point. Anytime we see our standard of living is not improving, there are really two concerns. So, one is for the folks who are here and for that next generation that basically feels like they're not any better off than the generation before. But then also for folks choosing to leave, and we see that in the numbers. We see that in outward migration from Canada to the U.S., where we've certainly always had that gap. That gap has always been there. There's never been a case where Canadians, on average, earn more than Americans. But when you go from an $8,000 gap to a $22,000 gap,
Mhm.
it starts to become more meaningful, especially when we're looking at after tax. If you're a higher earner, all of a sudden it just feels like there's more opportunities by moving south.
So, I mean, what does this mean for the future in terms of, I guess I'm thinking about government policy as well as, the resiliency of the Canadian economy. Have you done a thought experiment on what this all means?
Yeah, I mean, I think the consequences of if this were to continue are huge. And I will say, in terms of the why or what's driving this, I think we've done a lot of research over the last year. And the big one is just business investment.
Mhm.
If you look at the trends of business investment in Canada versus US, in Canada, it's actually declined over the last decade. In the US, it's grown by almost 50%. Right. So we're
Wow.
seeing very different trends in terms of business investment. And the reason that matters is business investment is essentially what makes us rich, right? As individuals and as a country. That is what makes us more productive, generate more income and wealth as a country. And that's really kind of the key driver behind these trends and something that we've been talking about for a long, long time as a business council and have actually just recently put out a
Mhm.
big report on essentially how do you get business investment back to Canada.
I I want to get to that because that's really important too. But you're from the Business Council of Alberta. Is there a difference between Alberta and Ontario or Alberta and the rest of the country on some of these stats?
So that's what's interesting when it comes to business investment trends over the last decade. It's, there's a lot of focus on the energy sector or on Alberta, and that's a big part of it. But the more concerning thing is it's really goes beyond the last decade, and it's really across provinces, across industries that you see this growing divergence. So it's much bigger and more concerning even just than Alberta and energy, although that's certainly a big part of the story for sure.
Yeah, so, Alberta does have the advantage of the energy extraction, but you're saying that this is a pan-Canadian issue, basically.
For sure, across provinces and industries, absolutely.
We're going to take another brief break. We'll be back with our guest after these messages. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. Again, my guest is Alicia Planincic. She is the Director of Policy and Economics at the Business Council of Alberta. So, Alicia, let's talk about. We've been talking about how bad the situation is relative to the U.S. I'm sure that means relative to other countries as well. But let's talk about prescriptions for a minute. We have a First of all, let's make the point. We have an uncertain world. The Prime Minister keeps talking about how uncertain the world is, but really the status quo when it comes to economic performance in Canada cannot continue. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point here is that what we're seeing, what we looked at is over the last decade. So this uncertainty, it's all sort of added on top of that. But our trajectory kind of before this moment and what we're dealing with tariffs and war and all this extra uncertainty, the trajectory already was not good. And I think this is really a moment of focusing on what is within our control. Certainly, there are a lot of things that are, almost completely out of our control right now, especially with the situation in the Middle East. But there's a lot within our control. And so that's where I think there's a lot we can do from a policy perspective to actually, get Canada back on a better trajectory for sure.
So let's talk about the policy perspective. That's your sort of meat and potatoes anyway, as in your role at the Business Council. What sort of policy prescriptions would you like to see?
Absolutely. I mean, it comes down to, like we were saying, business investment is really the driver of these differences that we're seeing in terms of income and prosperity, Canadians versus Americans. And what's driving that is really red tape and a bad regulatory environment. It's hard to do business in Canada. And, yes, you see this in business surveys. I'm sure you would perhaps expect to see that. But what we also see is even international comparisons. So the World Bank just did this fantastic business ready report looking at the business environment across countries, and Canada ranks very poorly due to its rules and regulations governing business. We rank about 33 out of 100 countries. The US, meanwhile, ranks fifth. And there are certain particular areas where I think it's almost just appalling how poorly Canada performs. And so I think those are really the areas where we can target. But it's really across the board where Canada's regulatory environment just is not conducive to businesses and business success. And we're seeing that play out in those prosperity indicators.
I guess another aspect of it is these interprovincial trade barriers, right? Like that adds bureaucracy and confusion and frustration when we don't have a single economic market in this country. Is this something you're tracking as well?
It's a huge piece of the puzzle, and in fact, the World Bank, they looked at kind of across the life cycle of a business where the regulations sort of most problematic in Canada, and one of those areas was actually regulations related to trade, both interprovincial and international, as well as taxation and something called they call it business location, but think of it basically as how difficult it is to actually set up your business. So open a storefront, open a new plant, expand your operations. So these are things that have to do with getting a construction permit or an environmental permit, and those are the areas where I would say we really, really, really do poorly. In fact, there's one on getting an environmental permit where it takes so long to get an environmental permit in Canada. We actually don't get any points or any credit for that measure because it takes almost a year just to get a permit and costs on average $400,000 just for a business to potentially get a no. And I think that's just kind of one specific example, but we see a lot of those sort of issues where it's harder to do business in Canada than it is in other countries.
Are there certain provinces that are dealing with this now? I certainly hear that Alberta is trying to cut red tape. Is this making a difference at all?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, unfortunately, a lot of the key regulations are federal or are, the two of them together where there's overlapping regulations. So our focus primarily has been on those federal regulations that oversee major projects and just kind of the regulatory system at large. And we've argued that yes, a lot of the things that we've seen by the Prime Minister have been good and in the right direction, but there's just not quite enough, accountability for results or focus on fixing the actual system. So one of the kind of concerns with, we're seeing this current red tape review federally, which is great, but unless you fix the system itself that leads to so much over-regulation, we're going to end up doing this process, every 5 to 10 years for the same sort of lackluster results. And so our argument has been you need to fix the actual system that
Right.
leads to too many regulations and poor regulations for businesses.
Alicia, we're going to take another brief break. We'll be back with you after these messages. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, having a conversation with Alicia Planincic. She is the Director of Policy and Economics at the Business Council of Alberta. Alicia, I'm not trying to drag you into partisan politics, far from it, but I have heard this argument many, many times and observation that, Canada has some economic challenges. That's what this whole program has been about. But we tend, as people, to blame all of our economic issues and challenges on Donald Trump. So I just like to get your feedback on that. Like, is that what you're getting from people in the policy field as well, that it's all Donald Trump's fault, or is it more nuanced than that?
That's interesting to some extent. I feel like I've seen more the opposite. At least the conversation in some of our circles is because there's so much that feels out of our control, with this CUSMA renegotiations or whatever is going to happen, or, the new potential 10% tariff or whatever will happen in the Middle East. That's a really good reason and a little bit of a kick in the butt, frankly, for us to focus on what we can control has been more our conversations. In fact, my sort of little personal concern is that things ease enough with the US and trade relations that we sort of forget to really, go put a lot of energy and continued support for solving these issues. If I think I'm worried that it lets up and it's kind of good enough soon enough that we forget, hey, there really is this big underlying problem, and we
Right.
really need to put a lot of resources toward addressing it. And it's going to take, frankly, more than just a red tape review here or a major projects office announcement there. Those are good things, but we haven't really fixed our underlying issues. We're talking the talk, I would say, in terms of the messaging that the Prime Minister is sharing with other leaders internationally. You probably know there's a investors conference that's coming up.
Right.
In Canada. That's great. That it's great that we're having these conversations and we're sharing this message that we want to be an energy superpower and we want to have the highest growth in the G7. That's all great, but until we do that underlying work, we're not going to really see that through. And I think one of the good things about the US is it does hopefully put a little bit of pressure on us to do that underlying, frankly, unsexy and difficult and lengthy work, but it's important and we need to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we did mention, or you did mention earlier in the program, taxation. So, do you have any thoughts about how our tax policy has to evolve to make us more competitive?
Yeah, a big one is actually simplification. We similarly looked at kind of cross international comparisons, and as much as yes, you can point out, and it's probably easier to point out differences just in terms of Canada taxes has higher tax rates than other competitive countries, but the actually bigger problem is just how complicated the system is relative to international peers. And this is something that I think we've been talking about for decades and decades, but it's only gotten, of course, worse and worse. And so I think it's hard for individual people to navigate, but it's definitely difficult for businesses to navigate. So I think simplifying that process should go together hand in hand with the regulatory system more broadly, which is also way too complicated, way too many regulations. We've just totally lost sight of what matters and what's most important.
So it's maybe the combination of the two that'll make a difference.
It really is both. Yeah, taxes and regulation. I think, if we were to say what is the most important thing for Canada to focus on to actually, be an energy superpower and see these major projects through, it's those. It's great, like I said, to see these announcements. Certainly big in Alberta is the conversation around the MOU and a potential pipeline. This is all moving in the right direction, good conversations, but there are still, even if, once that's hopefully all sorted on the MOU between Alberta and the federal government, there's still going to be some hard work to be done, from a policy perspective on the regulatory and tax front to ensure that Canada is actually competitive.
Indeed. Alicia, we've run out of time. This is a very important and interesting topic. Thanks for taking the time today to be on my program.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. That was Alicia Planincic. She is the Director of Policy and Economics at the Business Council of Alberta. Very interesting discussion about Canadian productivity and competitiveness, taxation, regulatory system. We've got a lot of work to do in this country. Thanks for watching today.